Education's meant to be the great social leveller, but have COVID school closures widened the gap between haves and have-nots? And if they have, what can policy do to close that gap again? Hello, Matthias.
Thanks for having us.
And Fabrizio, welcome as well.
Hello.
Now, Fabrizio, I'm sure that a lot of parents watching this, they won't need reminding, but how pervasive has the impact of school closures been over the last couple of years?
Very pervasive. So in many countries, the schools remain closed for about 90% of the time, with small windows in which they were open. That's true in North America, in the United States, in Canada, in Latin America. In Europe, there's an interesting amount of variation. So countries like Italy that also kept the schools shut for a long time, or Czech Republic and Romania, and then countries like Switzerland where the school remained open most of the time, with France, Germany and the UK in between. But altogether, it was a tremendous shock.
And Matthias, the initial research, we covered some of it on Vox Talks, focused on how good remote learning was as a substitute for that classroom experience. Did we ever reach a consensus on that?
I think we did. It can work in some cases. I've certainly met some students who said they actually enjoyed the online experience and being less distracted by their classmates. But on average, there were problems across the board. And these were to some extent organizational problems, just finding the Zoom links and getting this whole thing going. But also in terms of outcomes, it's now become very clear that the impact on learning was just quite bad across the board. So by now we have a first batch of empirical studies looking at change in test scores and attainment 2 years after the onset of the crisis, and we see slides in skills in many countries, many different settings, with also quite unequal outcomes.
Now, in this research, you've looked at two other ways, as well as the remote learning, why school closures might affect educational attainment. And the first one was that kids aren't meeting their friends, their peers. I don't get it. Why might that affect their education?
So there's really two important reasons. One is that there is some direct spillovers between friends in terms of learning. If you have a friend, you can study together. You can also take some cues from them in terms of your own objectives. If you're with other kids who are studying hard, who really care about the test, you will behave differently compared to having a bunch of friends who say just want to play video games or play soccer. On top of that, we had the second peer effect, which is that we had just a disruption of friendships. You were locked up in your house, you couldn't meet your friends. There's also psychological impact of that. And we are still finding out more about that, but some evidence from before the crisis suggests that this impact can also be quite important for affecting children's learning.
Right, and Fabrizio, the other one is the substitution of parents for teachers. And I know from a lot of my friends, and you can also see from Twitter, quite how hard parents found it to suddenly be involved with educating their children. Now, when you're doing this analysis, is this about the parents' level of education, how well they can understand what their kids are learning, or is it about the amount of time that they have to give to take part in their kids' learning?
Yeah, no doubt both matter. So some parents, like us, we are teachers by profession, so somehow we have an advantage on that. But we think that no less and even more important is the availability of time. So some parents were themselves locked at home, and they had to, and they were spending a lot of time with their children, and they could substitute teacher the best way they could, but others couldn't. Now, the interesting aspect of this, which we emphasize in our study, is that this is very much related to the socioeconomic characteristics of the households. So parents from more humble backgrounds were typically not allowed to telecommute. They had to go to the workplace, which sometimes was even harder than usual. So the amount of time they really had was less. Whereas for other parents, there was more time they could spend with their children. And of course, that helped a lot. Actually, no, our study suggests that if everybody had been free to choose the amount of time, the parents of the children struggling would have put more efforts. And it's natural, right? Your child makes it, you don't need to spend a lot of time. Your child struggles, you spend a lot of time. But exactly those parents were facing tighter constraints on time.
Yes, because interestingly in this research, you're not looking at the impact on the average child of this. You're looking at the impact on educational inequality. So when you combine all three of these factors, how big is the difference between the education that kids, I think you did it for low income and high income neighborhoods, are getting?
Right, it's quite large. So we combine the impact of the overall loss in learning that affects all children, together with the peer effects and the impact on parents. And as Fabrizio was saying, the impact through parents is highly unequal because lower income parents are more likely to be unable to work from home. So the time constraints are more binding. And the same thing is true for the peer effects. So we find that the peer environment is sliding more for kids from, say, lower income neighborhoods, just because they don't have access to the same peer groups they had in school. And in addition, in terms of the psychological impact of losing friends, that also turns out to be much worse for kids who are already struggling in school. If you are a straight A student, you may be affected in some way by losing friends, but it doesn't affect your academic performance as much. If you're kind of on the margin and struggling, this is when these effects come really into play. And so all of these effects combined make the impact larger for those from poorer neighborhoods who are already struggling in school, perhaps, and this gives you a large difference. So our baseline estimate is that after 1 year of the pandemic, we would expect grades to slide by almost a half a grade in the American scale. So from an A to a D, you would go from, say, maybe a B average to a B to C. And almost no change at all for those of the highest income neighborhoods. So really quite a large differential, which of course over time would also translate into differences in rates of college attendance and ultimately college graduation.
Yes, Fabrizio, that does make a huge difference, doesn't it? Because suddenly when you have those kids on the margin slipping down under that level, then the expectations for themselves and other people for them, it changes hugely.
It does. Now, of course, as schools reopen, part of this gap is absorbed. And, now our analysis tries also to make some informed guess about how much will stick and how much will go. The problem is that when kids go back to school, kids in wealthy areas will find themselves together with other kids that have had a relatively mild effect of the shutdown of schools, whereas poor neighborhood, the whole group will be impacted, and also the peer effect will be translated in worse outcomes for everybody. So there is definitely a catch-up over time, but it's slow. And so what we estimate is that for a kid starting high school and being impacted by COVID in the lowest 20th percentile of the income distribution, only half of the disadvantage that accrued in this year will be made up by subsequent years. So this is not just a short run, a short lasting effect. It's something that continues, and it will impact, as Matthias mentioned, on college attendance. We have some, of course, rough estimates that say their earning will go down relative to the counterfactual of no COVID by about 25%.
Gosh, so if there is very imperfect equivalent of catch-up growth, I suppose it is, in education, then, and education's meant to be society's leveller, then if you are society's policymaker, then you ought to be doing something about it. Surely, I'll ask both of you about this. What should policymakers be doing? Matthias, you first of all.
Yes, most importantly, they should be doing something quickly, because as Fabrizio was saying, education builds on education. Once you fall behind, you're struggling to catch up. And so the longer you wait, the harder it is to do anything about it at all. There's, of course, a number of things you can do. You can do special tutoring programs. You can extend the school day. What we have pointed out, and others working on this issue also, is that perhaps the biggest opportunity is to just make more use of the summer break. Especially the United States has a very long summer break, 2 to 3 months out of school, where actually we observe summer learning loss. Kids usually slide a bit behind during the summer. And this is just an opportunity to use a lot of this time to provide opportunities for catching up, in principle to all students, but of course in particular to the ones who are struggling the most. So you can do other things on top of that, but I think trying to get kids into school over the summer as soon as possible to make up some of these losses before the next school year starts is our biggest opportunity right now. And of course, we don't have that much time until the next summer. So I think the time to decide on this is now.
Fabrizio, what do you think?
I agree. And I would add that support to families, especially families in more need, is another policy tool that could and should be used. So these are the families who had a disadvantage in trying to help their children. Now the children go back to school. We know how important family support can be. And so again, flexible arrangements, being of course wary of other issues, like, we don't want that this falls on women and not on men, given the gender disparity. Matthias has been working on this. So we have to design policies that help families and they help it in a way that doesn't increase other dimensions of inequality.
Well, let's hope those policies are put in place, and as Matthias says, let's hope they're put in place quickly. But for both of you, Fabrizio, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having us.
And Matthias, thank you as well.
Thank you for having us.
For more on this, the triple impact of school closures on educational inequality is the Vox column you should be looking for. The authors are Francesco Agostinelli, Matthias Döpke, Giuseppe Sorrenti, and Fabrizio Zilibotti. It was published on the 21st of January. And if you want to go right back to the source, then the paper is called When the Great Equaliser Shuts Down, Schools, Peers and Parents in Pandemic Times, and that was published in the Journal of Public Economics, volume 206. Well, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.